She was found discarded like broken glass in the freezing snowdrift of a South Side Chicago alley, partially stripped, violently strangled, and alone. But she wasn't an isolated tragedy. 100 miles away in a computer server room in Alexandria, Virginia, a machine built to hunt the dead was churning through decades of forgotten FBI homicide files. When the algorithm finally locked onto a pattern, the screen illuminated a horrifying reality, and it isolated a dense cluster of red dots on the map of Chicago. The machine had uncovered a human hunting ground. 51 red dots, 51 women. The vast majority were black, aged 18 to 58, their bodies tossed into the garbage bins, vacant lots, and overgrown alleys of the city's west and south sides. Nearly all of them had been strangled. For this localized cluster of violence, the police clearance rate was basically zero. The math said that this was a statistic impossibility. 51 women were not murdered by 51 unconnected people using the exact same method of execution in the same neglected neighborhoods. How many monsters were operating with impunity in the shadows of America's third largest city? The Chicago Police Department rushed to deny it. They pointed to the lack of physical evidence, insisting that there was no threat and no serial killer. But algorithms don't care about police public relations or the police official narratives. They only care about the data. The bodies left sitting in the dilapidated properties of Washington Park and Garfield Park. The Dragnet, which was built by investigative journalist Thomas Hargrove, was exposing the invisible footprints of predators that law enforcement had missed. Could a computer catch a killer when the cops either couldn't or wouldn't? Hargrove's creation is the Murder Accountability Project, and it's fueled by the most comprehensive sourced homicide database in the United States. From 2001 to 2018, the algorithm mapped a specific north to south axis of death, heavily concentrated near South Indiana Avenue in Bronzeville. The killers operated with a frequency that bodies began dropping on the exact same days. On May 20th, 2003, Tarika Jones and Linda Green were both discovered. 5 months later, Letitia Hall and Lucy Sett Thompson were found slain on the exact same date. We absolutely believe that the recent killings are part of a continuing pattern, Hargrove warned the public. But if this wasn't the work of one prolific strangler, what alternative is there? The killers were exploiting the systemic apathy of the city of Chicago itself. They hunted the less dead women, women with histories of substance abuse or minor criminal records whose disappearances wouldn't spark a media frenzy, because society refused to see themselves in the faces of these struggling, predominantly black women. So public outrage never materialized. The killers knew they could use the unlit alleys of the 2nd, 3rd, 7th, and 11th district as a graveyard. But who were the women behind the algorithm's glowing red dots? They were protective sisters, loving daughters, and mothers whose lives were violently interrupted. Gwendolyn Williams was the guardian angel of her 5 younger siblings, a woman who cooked homemade cornbread and shielded her family from the unforgiving Chicago streets. On June 11th, 2002, she was watching movies and planning kisses on her sister's Dalmatian. The next day, her battered, half-dressed body was found bleeding behind a dollar store. Gwendolyn fought back, trapping the killer's skin cells beneath her fingernails. Yet, even with this physical evidence, her killer vanished like a ghost. The Murder Accountability Project's database is the most complete accounting of homicide in the United States, compiled through aggressive Freedom of Information Act requests and lawsuits against the FBI and state agencies that failed to report their murder statistics. The database houses records on nearly 1 million killings dating back to 1976. The methodology in the MAP algorithm is effective. The system evaluates specific variables: the circumstances of the death, the weapon used, the number of offenders, the victim's sex, and race. The algorithm doesn't identify the killer. It identifies the victim who possesses an elevated probability of having been killed by a common predator. Hargrove's system had already proven that it was accurate. In 2014, the algorithm flagged a cluster of 15 unsolved female strangulations in Gary, Indiana. Hargrove warned the Gary Police Department about an active serial killer. That warning was validated when Darren Vann was arrested and confessed to the murders. When Hargrove used the algorithm on Chicago, it identified a pattern that made the Gary killings seem dwarfed. From 2001 to 2018, the system isolated 51 unsolved strangulations of women. There was a distinct drop-off in cases around 2014, suggesting the killer may have been incarcerated or otherwise unable to kill, before the pattern resumed in March 2017. Hargrove gave his assessment to the public and CPD. We absolutely believe believe that the recent killings are part of a continuing pattern. It's highly unlikely that these 50 women were murdered by 50 separate people. The environments in which these 51 women were killed tell a story of marginalization and systemic apathy. The slayings were on Chicago's south and west side, within police districts carrying long histories of violent crime and neglect, such as Wentworth, Grand Crossing, Inglewood, and Fillmore. The killers relied on the decay of these neighborhoods to hide their work. According to the Murder Accountability Project's data, 94% of the victims were found dead outdoors. They were partially or fully stripped, strangled, and occasionally set on fire to destroy forensic evidence. The perpetrators treated the city's infrastructure as a graveyard, exploiting vacant lots, overgrown alleys, and dilapidated properties to conceal the bodies of women that they felt were disposable. The disposal methods used by the killer or killers show a predator that was comfortable with the environment. They possessed an intimate knowledge of Chicago's grid, understanding exactly which alleyways were unlit and which abandoned buildings were ignored by the city. The statistics show consistency. On average, over an 18-year period, there were about 3 of these specific murders a year. The violence peaked in 2003, a year that had 8 related strangulation victims discovered: Nancy Walker, Tarika Jones, Linda Green, Linda Barasio, LaTanya Keeler, Latricia Hall, Lucy Sett Thomas, and Ethel Emerson. The killers were operating so frequently that bodies began appearing on the same day. The demographics of the victims make it clear who they were targeting. 76% of the victims were African American. The median age was 36, with the youngest being 18-year-old Makalava Williams and the oldest being 58-year-old Catherine Satterfield Buchanan. The killers selected women pushed to the fringes of society. The Chicago Police Department noted that many of the victims had histories of sex work, substance abuse, and minor criminal records. For the calculus of a predator, these women were less important, less dead. That media's blatant disregard for minority victims of violence has reverberating consequences on a number of levels. It is clear that when society cares about victims of crime and can empathize with their experience, the result is public outrage that has an effect on a police response. Because the public did not see themselves in the faces of these addicted and struggling Black women, the outrage never materialized. The apathy of the system was weaponized, turning the South Side into a limitless hunting ground. The first victim to trigger the pattern was Angela Mariana Ford, and she was discovered in an abandoned building on January 4th, 2001. Over the next 17 years, 50 more women would follow her into the dark. Public outrage erupted following a series of investigative reports by CBS 2's Pam Zeckman, who brought the 51 unsolved strangulations to the attention of lawmakers and the public. Grieving family members testified before the Illinois Senate Public Health Committee, demanding accountability for the thousands of SA kits and crime scene samples sitting untested. The intense media scrutiny triggered an emergency overhaul. In May 2019, U.S. Congressman Bobby Rush escalated the issue to the federal level, writing a letter to FBI Director Christopher Wray, requesting that the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit undertake the investigation into the murder of the 51 women. At that time, Governor J.B. Pritzker established the Forensic Science Task Force, chaired by Illinois State Police Director Brendan F. Kelly, to implement rapid solutions at the state level. The state injected resources into the forensic labs using robotics to increase DNA casework capacity in November 2019. They installed rapid DNA technology and undertook an aggressive hiring plan for forensic scientists, all while navigating the resource strain of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Illinois State Police achieved a massive 48% reduction in the biology DNA backlog by November 30th, 2020, dropping the number of pending cases from 9,289 to 4,857. The average turnaround time dropped from 247 days to 110 days. The state finally caught up to the minimum standard required to hunt a modern serial killer. But for the 51 women murdered in Chicago, the state's sudden efficiency arrived decades too late. And when the lab finally pushed the long-awaited DNA through the system, the results shattered the core theory of the investigation. Chicago Police Superintendent Eddie Johnson ordered a comprehensive review of all 51 strangulation cases. Detectives scoured the cold case files to determine if biological evidence had been collected at various crime scenes and whether it remained viable for testing after years of neglect. Out of the 51 victims, investigators were only able to extract 21 samples of DNA from 18 of the homicides. Decades of exposure to the elements, made worse by bodies being intentionally burned, dumped in trash cans, or left to decompose in abandoned buildings, had degraded much of the physical evidence. The Chicago Police Department ran the 21 intact samples through newly modernized ISP lab and the FBI's combined DNA index system. In November 2020, the results were made public. None of the 21 DNA samples cross-matched with one another. None of the samples matched any existing DNA profile of identified criminals within the FBI database. To the Chicago Police Department, the lack of biological cross-matching was vindication. It reinforced their initial assertion that there was no singular Chicago Strangler roaming the streets. If one man was responsible for the carnage, 21 samples would have lit up the system with a web of interconnected forensic hits. Instead, there was silence. But for Thomas Hargrove and the analysts at the Murder Accountability Project, the absence of DNA did not disprove the existence of serial killer. Instead, it underscored the sophistication of the predator. Strangulation is a deeply intimate, violent physical crime that requires transfer of biological material through scratches, defensive wounds, saliva, and assay. The fact that CPD could only recover 21 samples from 51 brutal murders suggests an abnormal level of forensic countermeasures. The killers are pretty intelligent and are aware not to leave their DNA behind, suggesting that the perpetrators wore condoms, scrubbed the bodies, or targeted victims in outdoor environments where evidence degrades more quickly. Because 94% of the victims were found outdoors or in abandoned structures, the data suggests stranger-on-stranger violence, ruling out domestic disputes or crimes of passion that typically occur indoors. There are two theories. The first theory is that a singular, highly organized predator is responsible for the vast majority of the slayings. This individual has an encyclopedic knowledge of Chicago's South and West Sides. He's mobile, transient, and clean. He targets vulnerable women, sex workers, and addicts because he knows their routines and knows that they will willingly enter a vehicle or an abandoned building with a stranger without alerting any suspicion. This person uses the apathy of the Chicago Police Department and the DNA backlog as a shield, orchestrating an 18-year-old reign of terror without leaving a microscopic trace of his identity. The other theory is darker. It's that there is no singular Chicago Strangler. Instead, the cluster represents a shared hunting ground utilized by multiple unconnected killers. Under this theory, the socioeconomic decay of the city's South and West Side, combined with the extreme vulnerability of the victims and the historic indifference of police, predators recognized that they could strangle, and discard women without triggering a police response. If these 51 women were not murdered by one mastermind, they were slaughtered by a bunch of violent men using the same marginalized population in the same geographic areas. There have been tips provided by witnesses to the CPD that suggest the possibility of 2 or 3 separate serial killers working simultaneously within the city. The arrest of Arthur Hilliard supports the multiple killer theory. Hilliard was arrested in January 2020 and charged with the 2017 murder of 21-year-old Diamond Turner. Turner's body had been stuffed into a Southside trash bin. Hilliard's DNA linked him directly to the scene, providing the only breakthrough in the 51 cases. In December 2025, he was convicted of her homicide and sentenced to 50 to 100 years in prison. Hilliard was a highly violent offender. He was convicted of concealing a body in an unrelated 2018 murder and remains a prime suspect in other fatal stabbings. Yet the Chicago Police Department stated that Hilliard's DNA did not link him to the other 50 women in the strangulation cluster. He was a monster, but he was not the monster. He was merely a predator operating within the hunting ground. If Arthur Hilliard was responsible for only one of the 51 bodies, the reality dictates that there are 50 other unsolved homicides and potentially 50 other killers walking free. As of 2026, the algorithmic map of Chicago remains stained with the unresolved red dots of the Chicago Strangler cluster. The killer, or the network of killers, who murdered dozens of marginalized women in the shadow of the Chicago skyline, have successfully evaded prosecution. The 51 women who were abandoned in trash cans and vacant lots of Garfield Park and Washington Park were treated as disposable, but the data remembers them. The algorithm does not forget. And somewhere in the dark alleys of Chicago, the men who left those bodies are still walking free.